Good evening. I'm your host, and this is Kenya News Update today. In a development that has sent shockwaves through global diplomatic circles, U.S. President Donald Trump has publicly stated he is considering a limited military strike on Iran. The remarks, made from the White House on Friday, February 21st, 2026, represent a dramatic escalation in rhetoric aimed at pressuring Tehran to return to negotiations over its nuclear program. President Trump told reporters, and I quote, "I guess I can say I am considering that." He added that the world would find out, over the next, probably, 10 days, whether a deal would be reached or the U.S. would take military action. This comes after a report in the Wall Street Journal on Thursday detailed that the administration was weighing an initial limited strike on Iranian military or government sites. Tonight, we take a deep dive into what a limited strike could look like, the potential for regional escalation, the economic context at home, and the stark warnings from international allies. We'll also analyze the specific military assets in the region and the political calculus for a president in his second term. This is a 12-minute special report. First, let's define what a limited military strike means in the modern context. Military analysts suggest this would not be a full-scale invasion or a prolonged campaign, but rather a targeted operation designed to send a message. We're likely talking about precision-guided munitions launched from standoff platforms. The most probable assets in theater right now include U.S. Air Force F-35 Lightning II fighters based in the UAE, B-1B Lancer bombers that could be deployed from Diego Garcia, and U.S. Navy assets in the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea. USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group is currently on a scheduled deployment in the eastern Mediterranean, which is approximately 1,200 miles from potential Iranian targets. More immediately, the U.S. Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, has significant firepower. This includes guided missile destroyers like the USS Paul Ignatius, which carries over 90 Tomahawk land attack missiles. A single destroyer's payload could theoretically target dozens of sites. For context, in April 2020, the U.S. launched 59 Tomahawk missiles at a Syrian airfield. A similar scale strike on Iran would be considered limited but highly destructive. Potential targets, according to security briefings, would likely be tied directly to Iran's nuclear and missile programs to maintain a clear, defensible link to the stated objective. These could include the Natanz fuel enrichment plant, which houses thousands of centrifuges, or the Fordo fuel enrichment plant built into a mountain. Striking these would be a profound step, effectively destroying years of nuclear development. Other targets might be command and control nodes for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, naval bases that house fast attack craft responsible for harassing commercial shipping or missile production facilities. The key strategic question is, would such a strike actually halt Iran's program, or simply delay it and guarantee a massive retaliation? Iran's asymmetric response capabilities are formidable. They could unleash proxy forces across the region, targeting U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria, where an estimated 2,500 U.S. troops remain. They could ramp up attacks on commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, through which 21 million barrels of oil pass daily, representing 21% of global petroleum consumption. They could also launch ballistic missiles from their own territory or via proxies, like the Houthis in Yemen. The Houthis have recently demonstrated the capability to strike targets over 1,000 miles away. Now, let's examine the domestic context in the United States. President Trump's comments come amid mixed economic signals. Just this morning, revised data showed U.S. GDP growth for the fourth quarter of 2025 came in at 1.4%, well below economist estimates of 2.1%. This slowdown could be a factor in the administration's foreign policy calculus. Historically, presidents have sometimes turned to foreign conflicts to rally national unity and divert attention from domestic troubles. However, public opinion on military action is complex. A recent poll by the Pew Research Center showed that only 35% of Americans would support unilateral U.S. military action against Iran to prevent it from obtaining a nuclear weapon. That support jumps to 62% if it were part of a coalition with key allies. The problem for the White House is that key allies are not on board. Britain, France, and Germany, the E3 nations who negotiated the original 2015 nuclear deal, have all issued statements urging extreme caution and a return to diplomacy. A unilateral strike would fracture the Western alliance in a way not seen since the 2003 Iraq War. Speaking of the 2015 deal, the JCPOA, or Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, is the ghost at this feast. The agreement, which Trump withdrew from in 2018, had placed strict limits on Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. Since the U.S. withdrawal and reimposition of crushing sanctions, Iran has gradually breached the deal's limits. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency's latest report, Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium now stands at approximately 4,500 kilograms. Of that, 320 kilograms is enriched to 60% purity, which is just a short technical step from weapons-grade 90%. Before the JCPOA collapsed, that stockpile was limited to 300 kilograms of uranium, enriched to only 3.67%. Iran's breakout time, the time needed to produce enough fissile material for one nuclear weapon, has shrunk from over 12 months under the JCPOA to an estimated 12 days or less, according to some experts. This rapidly closing window is the core driver of the current crisis. The regional reaction has been one of profound alarm. Israeli Prime Minister has privately expressed support for any action that sets back Iran's program, but publicly, Israel is maintaining a studied silence, wary of being seen as the instigator. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, while historically hostile to Iran, have invested heavily in diplomatic and economic détente with Tehran over the past 3 years. A U.S. strike would force them into an impossible position, potentially making their territory targets for retaliation. In Kenya, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is monitoring the situation closely. A major conflict in the Gulf would have direct consequences for Kenya's economy. Kenya imports a significant portion of its petroleum products from the Middle East. A sustained closure of the Strait of Hormuz could cause fuel prices to skyrocket. Furthermore, any global economic shock triggered by an oil price spike would hurt Kenya's tourism and export sectors. President William Ruto's administration is likely to join calls for restraint through multilateral bodies like the UN and the African Union. Let's talk about the legal and constitutional framework. In the United States, the power to declare war rests with Congress. However, the 1973 War Powers Resolution allows a president to commit armed forces for up to 60 days without congressional approval, with a 30-day withdrawal period. A limited strike would almost certainly be executed under this authority. The administration would argue it constitutes defensive action to prevent a nuclear threat, not a war. This legal justification would be hotly contested. Furthermore, the United Nations Charter prohibits the use of force except in self-defense or with Security Council authorization. A preemptive strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, absent an imminent threat, would be a clear violation of international law. This would place the U.S. alongside nations it has frequently criticized for violating sovereignty, damaging its moral authority and its ability to rally international coalitions for future crises. What are the potential unintended consequences? Beyond immediate retaliation, a strike could solidify hardliner control in Tehran, extinguishing any remaining moderate voices. It could end any hope of a diplomatic solution for a generation, guaranteeing Iran will pursue a weapon as a deterrent. It could also trigger a regional arms race, with Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt seeking their own security guarantees, potentially including nuclear technology. The humanitarian cost must also be considered. Even a precision strike on a remote facility could cause casualties if military and civilian infrastructure are co-located. Escalation to a wider conflict could displace millions in an already volatile region, creating a new refugee crisis. The economic cost globally could be staggering. Analysts at Bloomberg Economics estimate a full-scale conflict that closes the Strait of Hormuz could push oil prices to $150 per barrel and trigger a global recession, wiping an estimated $1.5 trillion from world GDP. Finally, we consider the 10-day timeline. President Trump said the world would know in about 10 days. This creates a tense window for last-minute diplomacy. The Swiss, who represent U.S. interests in Iran, are likely engaged in frantic back-channel communications. China and Russia, both with significant economic ties to Iran, are urging calm but have limited leverage over Washington. The next move may come from the IAEA Board of Governors, which could convene an emergency session to issue a critical report, providing a diplomatic off-ramp, or conversely, a justification for action. For the global markets, these 10 days will be fraught with volatility. The VIX index, a key measure of market fear, has already jumped 18% since the president's comments. The price of gold, a traditional safe haven asset, has risen by 2.5% to $2,150 per ounce. In conclusion, the statement from the White House is a deliberate and dangerous raising of the stakes. It moves the discussion from the realm of sanctions and diplomacy to the very real possibility of kinetic action. While framed as limited, the history of conflict teaches us that the first strike is often the easiest to predict, the subsequent chain of events is not. The coming days will test the nerves of diplomats, military planners, and leaders worldwide. The hope, however faint, is that this public ultimatum is itself a tool of pressure, a high-stakes bluff designed to force a breakthrough at the negotiating table. The fear is that it is a sincere declaration of intent, setting the stage for the first major interstate war of the 2020s. The world is watching and waiting. For Kenya News Update Today, I'm your host. Subscribe to Kenya News Update Today for continuing coverage of this developing story.